Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today we're looking at something that isn't just a book. It's more like a schematic, a kind of blueprint for how a so-called democratic society can manufacture agreement.
That is a very big promise. We are diving into Radical Priorities by Noam Chomsky, and we're also pulling in some key essays from The Responsibility of Intellectuals. And look, I think we have to say it up front. When people hear the name Chomsky, they tend to have a pretty visceral reaction.
Oh, absolutely. He's either seen as this great hero or a total pariah, and it mostly just depends on, which corner of the internet you live in.
Which is exactly why we're here. We need to strip away the personality, the politics, all that baggage.
Right. We are not here to debate his specific position on every single thing that's happened in the last 50 years. That's not the point of this deep dive.
No. We are here to tackle a systemic question that he poses. And it's, I think, arguably one of the most important riddles of modern democracy.
It is. It's this central puzzle.
And that puzzle, as I'm getting it from the source material, is what we can call the paradox of freedom. It goes something like this. In a totalitarian state, think Stalin's Russia or Nazi Germany, the government controls its people with a club, a bludgeon.
It's straightforward, brutal, but simple.
Yeah, if you step out of line, you get a knock on the door in the middle of the night and you disappear. It's control through overt, terrifying violence.
Precisely. The mechanism is fear. But here's the puzzle, the paradox. How do you control a population in a society that calls itself free? In a place like the United States or Canada or the UK, the government generally can't just throw you in a gulag for having the wrong opinion.
That bludgeon is, for the most part, off the table for its own citizens.
It is, and yet these societies remain incredibly stable. The status quo just kind of persists. The distribution of wealth and power stays remarkably consistent, no matter which political party is in charge. So if they aren't using force, what are they using?
If you can't control the body.
You have to control the mind.
Or maybe not the mind itself, but the framework of thought.
That's it, exactly. You have to control the boundaries of what is considered thinkable. The source material puts it in this really stark, chilling phrase. It says, propaganda is to democracy what the bludgeon is to a totalitarian state.
Wow. That's a heavy way to start propaganda. That's such a loaded word. We think of it as something, they do, the bad guys.
Of course. We have information, we have news, they have propaganda.
And that very belief, the idea that we're somehow immune to it, that it only happens to other people, that right there is the first and maybe the biggest victory of the very system we're about to try and map out.
It's the system's invisibility cloak. So our mission for this deep dive is to look at what the source material calls the engineering of consent. We're going to trace the incentive structures, the institutions, the economic filters that determine what you see on your screen every day, and by extension, what you come to believe is possible or impossible.
So let's get into the context for this. We're looking at Radical Priorities. This isn't just one book written from scratch. It's a collection of essays and talks. And to really get it, we have to understand where it came from. Because there's this huge glaring irony at the very center of Chomsky's entire career.
I like to call it the irony of place. And for a systems analysis, it's absolutely crucial. So here's the setup. Noam Chomsky, arguably the world's most famous dissident, the guy who's just relentlessly critiquing American imperialism, the military-industrial complex. Where does he spend his entire academic life?
At MIT. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
And we need to be clear about what MIT was in the 1950s and 60s when he was starting out. It wasn't just some quirky school for engineers and math geniuses.
No, not at all. It was, for all intents and purposes, a research and development branch of the Pentagon.
That's not an exaggeration. The source material makes it really clear that during this period, MIT's funding was overwhelmingly from the Department of Defense and other military branches. We're talking about places like the Research Laboratory of Electronics, the Lincoln Lab. These labs weren't just doing abstract science.
They weren't building better dishwashers.
They were designing guidance systems for intercontinental ballistic missiles. They were developing the radar and computer systems that would be used in the Vietnam War. They were at the absolute heart of the war machine.
So you have this one guy sitting in an office, and his salary is effectively being paid by the military, and he's using that time and that platform to write books and give speeches about how the military is engaged in, what he calls criminal acts.
It seems like a complete contradiction.
It does. And it begs the question, why didn't they just fire him? Or, at least cut his funding? Why would the system tolerate its most vocal critic right in its own nerve center?
And that question and the answer to it reveals just how sophisticated and resilient the system is. A more rigid, brittle system like a classic dictatorship would have just thrown him out, purged him.
Sure, no question.
But a democratic system is, in a way, smarter. It doesn't just crush dissent, it absorbs it, it manages it.
What do you mean it absorbs it?
Well, think about it from the perspective of MIT's administration. By keeping Chomsky on the payroll, they get to do something very valuable. They get to say, look how committed we are to free speech. Look how open we are. We have the world's most radical critic right here on our faculty.
It becomes a PR win, a badge of liberal honor.
Exactly. It burnishes their reputation. Meanwhile, and this is the crucial part, does Chomsky's presence in Building 20 actually stop the missile research happening in the Lincoln lab across town?
No, of course not. The engineers keep engineering. The contracts keep getting signed.
The structural output of the institution remains exactly the same. The missiles get built, the policies he's protesting get enacted, the dissent is allowed because it's been effectively contained. It's like a pressure release valve on a boiler. It lets off steam so the whole thing doesn't explode.
It's almost like the system is saying, you can shout all you want, as long as you don't actually get in the way of the assembly line.
Or as long as it doesn't interrupt the flow of money. And this is a perfect segue into the core philosophy in the book. Before we get into the media and the politics, the whole engineering part, we have to understand why the source material thinks the current system is so fundamentally broken. It all comes back to this term he uses, Libertarian Socialism.
Okay, let's pause there.
Yeah.
Because in the modern, especially the American political dictionary, those two words are like oil and water. They do not mix.
Not at all.
Libertarian makes you think of, don't tread on me, minimal government, free markets.
Mm-hmm.
And socialism makes you think of the exact opposite, state control, central planning.
Right. So this is one of those moments where we have to do what some people call linguistic decontamination. Chomsky is using these terms not in their 21st century cable news sense, but in their original historical 19th century Enlightenment sense.
Okay, so let's break that down. What's the core distinction he's making?
He's contrasting two fundamentally different views of human nature. On one side, you have the dominant view in Western societies, what we might call classical liberalism or the ideology of capitalism. This view assumes that the fundamental human drive, our core motivation, is acquisitiveness.
We want stuff. Homo economicus.
We want to acquire things. We want to consume. The philosophy is called possessive individualism. The goal of your life is to accumulate as much property and wealth as you can, and the goal of society is to set up a system of laws to protect your pile of stuff from my pile of stuff.
I shop, therefore I am.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Now, on the other side, you have Chomsky's Libertarian Socialism, and this is based on a completely different premise. The idea here is that the fundamental human need is not to consume, but to be creative. Yeah, that humans have this innate drive to inquire freely, to create, to build, to work in solidarity with others. From this point of view, work isn't supposed to be this horrible drudgery you do just to get a paycheck. It's meant to be a meaningful expression of your own talents and creativity.
So in this original sense, a libertarian isn't someone who just hates taxes. It's someone who hates any form of authority that stifles that creative impulse.
That is the absolute core of it. The argument is that any structure of authority, whether it's the state, a government bureaucrat, or, crucially, a private corporation and your boss, is not legitimate by default. It has to justify its existence.
It has to prove that it's necessary.
Yes. And if it can't prove that it serves the human needs of the people under its control, then it should be dismantled. So libertarian socialism isn't about the government owning everything. It's about dismantling illegitimate authority, which leads to the idea of workers and communities democratically controlling their own workplaces and lives.
Okay, that makes more sense now. But it also sounds, incredibly utopian. We obviously don't live in that world. We live in a world of hierarchy and consumption.
And that massive gap, the gap between what he sees as our innate creative potential and the rigid authoritarian reality of our daily lives, that is precisely where the engineering of consent becomes necessary. The system, to survive, has to convince us that this reality, the hierarchy, the consumption, the lack of real control, is the only possible way for the world to be.
It has to manufacture passivity.
Yeah.
It has to make us accept our lot.
Correct. Because if people truly believed they could organize their own work and their own communities, the entire edifice of concentrated power would be under threat. So the system creates a specialized class of people whose job it is to manage our perceptions and justify the status quo. The source calls them the new mandarins.
The mandarins. That's a throwback to the scholar officials of imperial China, right? The educated elite who ran the bureaucracy.
It's the same concept. And we need to be very precise about what the source material means by intellectuals or mandarins. We're not just talking about smart people in general.
Right. My auto mechanic is brilliant, but he's probably not a new mandarin in this sense.
No. The intellectuals in this analysis are a specific social class. They are the people who have the training, the credentials, the platforms, and the leisure time to shape public opinion. We're talking about top journalists, policy experts in think tanks, celebrity academics, political consultants, media pundits.
The people you see on TV on a Sunday morning explaining the world to us.
The secular priesthood, as it's sometimes called. And their social function, according to this analysis, is not to pursue truth wherever it leads. Their primary function is to provide the ideological justification for the actions of state and corporate power. They're the ones who explain why it's necessary to go to war, or why it's fiscally irresponsible to have free college.
But hold on a second. I know some of these people, journalists, professors. Most of them are genuinely decent people. They don't wake up in the morning thinking of themselves as propagandists. They see themselves as the good guys, the watchdogs of democracy.
And this is the most important psychological insight in the entire analysis. It's what makes the system so effective. If these people were all cynical liars, if they were sitting in a back room somewhere saying, okay, how do we fool the public today? It wouldn't work.
Why not?
Because you can usually smell a cynical liar from a mile away. Sincerity is much more persuasive. The genius of the system is that it doesn't require conscious liars. It just requires obedience.
They believe their own hype.
They have to believe it. In order to rise to a position of real influence, to become a New York Times columnist, a tenured professor at an Ivy League school, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, you have to have first internalized the fundamental values and assumptions of the system. You have to think the right thoughts.
So it's not a conspiracy, it's a filtering process.
It's an institutional filter. Exactly. Let's run a thought experiment. Imagine a bright, ambitious young journalist just starting out. She really wants to uncover injustice and change the world. She digs up a story that fundamentally questions the legitimacy of, say, a major pharmaceutical company or a core premise of U.S. foreign policy. What happens to that story?
Well, first, her editor probably tells her it's not objective, that she needs to get a quote from the company's PR department to balance it.
Right. Tone it down. Be more professional. If she keeps writing stories like that, stories that challenge power, instead of just reporting on the squabbles between powerful people, she starts to get a reputation.
She's difficult. She's an activist, not a journalist. She's biased.
Exactly. She doesn't get the promotions. She doesn't get assigned to the prestigious beats. She doesn't get the invitations to the elite dinners where she can get scoops from sources. She's sidelined.
But if she plays the game, if she focuses on the horse race of who's up and who's down in Washington, if she implicitly accepts the official government narrative as the baseline for reality,
then she thrives. She gets access. She gets praised for her sobriety and realism. And over a 20-year career, she completely convinces herself that she is the responsible one. And the critics outside the system are just naive children who don't understand how the real world works.
So the system doesn't need to censor. It just selects for obedience. It rewards those who don't question the foundational assumptions.
And this creates the intellectual climate for what the source material calls a spectator democracy. The mandarins, the responsible experts, they genuinely come to believe that the general public, you, me, everyone listening, are just not equipped to manage our own affairs.
This is where that phrase from Walter Lippmann comes in, isn't it? The bewildered herd.
It's a brutal phrase, but it's incredibly revealing. Lippmann, who was a celebrated progressive intellectual, and Edward Bernays, the so-called father of public relations, both openly argued that the public is basically a chaotic, irrational stampede of cattle.
And if you let the herd just run wild,
they'll trample everything. They'll destroy civilization. So the role of the intelligent minority, the responsible men, is to guide and domesticate the herd, to protect them from themselves.
I have to say, being called a member of a bewildered herd feels like it's profoundly insulting. It's so condescending.
It is. But you have to understand, this isn't just an insult. It's the quiet, unspoken operating system of our modern democracy. The core idea is this. You, the citizen, are a spectator, not a participant. Your job is to show up every few years and choose which member of the elite gets to manage things for you.
You can cheer for Team Red or Team Blue.
Exactly. But you are not allowed on the field. You're not allowed to question the rules of the game or suggest a different game entirely. Your consent is to be engineered.
And the most powerful tool for keeping us in the stands isn't overt censorship. It's what the book calls setting the bounds of thinkable thought.
This is the part of the analysis that, for me, is the most powerful, because we have a very primitive idea of censorship. We think censorship means a government agent saying, you are forbidden from saying that.
Like in the old Soviet Union, the state newspaper, Pravda, prints the one official truth. If you print something different, you go to the gulag. It's easy to see, and it's easy to hate.
But in our system, it's so much more subtle. We have debates. We have 24-hour news channels with people screaming at each other. It looks like a vibrant exchange of ideas.
And the system loves those debates. It encourages them.
It absolutely does, because as long as we are all passionately arguing about option A versus option B, we're all implicitly accepting that the entire universe of legitimate options consists only of A and B. We don't even notice that options C, D, and E have been completely excluded from the conversation.
Let's make this really concrete. The source material uses the Vietnam War as the classic case study. Yeah. So let's try to role-play this a bit, just to show how the bounds of thinkable thought actually sound in practice.
Great idea. So it's 1968, the war is raging. You turn on your TV to one of the 3 channels you have, and there's a serious debate between 2 very serious men. On one side, you have the hawk.
Okay, I can do the hawk. We must see this through. Our commitment to freedom is on the line in Vietnam. The domino theory is real. If we don't fight the communists in Saigon, we'll be fighting them on the beaches of California. We need to escalate, send more troops, and have the resolve to win.
Perfect. A classic hawk position. Now, on the other side of the debate, representing the anti-war position in the mainstream, you have the dove.
All right, I'm the dove now. Senator, I must respectfully disagree. This war has become a tragic mistake. It's a quagmire. The financial cost is bankrupting our great society programs at home, and the human cost is far too high. The South Vietnamese government is hopelessly corrupt. We need to seek a negotiated settlement and bring our boys home before we sink any deeper.
Okay. Now, to the average person watching that at home, that sounds like a full, vigorous debate, right? The hawk says stay and win. The dove says it's too costly. Let's get out. They're yelling. It seems like the entire spectrum of opinion is represented.
It does. It feels like democracy in action.
But step back for a second. Look closer. What is the one single foundational assumption that both the hawk and the dove accept without question?
They both assume. They both assume that the United States has the right to be in Vietnam in the first place, the right to invade another country and socially engineer it.
Exactly. The hawk says, we can win and it's our duty. The dove says it's too expensive and difficult to win, but neither one of them is saying the third thing. Neither of them is articulating the forbidden thought.
Which is?
The United States is committing a supreme international crime. This is an act of aggression. We have no more right to be in Vietnam than the Nazis had to be in Poland. It is fundamentally and morally wrong, regardless of whether it's cheap or expensive, winnable or unwinnable.
And if someone tried to go on mainstream television in 1968 and say that,
they wouldn't be debated. They would be ridiculed. They'd be dismissed as a communist sympathizer, as unserious, as emotional. The moderator would cut them off and go to a commercial break. By confining the debate to a tactical question, how to conduct the war, the system reinforces the unquestioned strategic premise that the war itself is a legitimate undertaking.
It's brainwashing under conditions of freedom. You're given the freedom to choose between 2 pre-approved positions, which gives you the illusion of choice, while the most important questions are never even allowed to be asked.
And you can apply that same filter to almost any major issue today. Let's take the economy.
Okay.
The acceptable debate is, should the government cut taxes to stimulate growth versus should the government invest in infrastructure to stimulate growth?
And the forbidden thought is,
why is growth the only goal? What about sustainability or equality or well-being? And why is the whole system predicated on a small group of investors making decisions for everyone else? That's just not part of the conversation. It's unrealistic.
So the engineering of consent isn't about forcing you to believe one thing. It's about drawing a very small circle and telling you that all reasonable thought exists inside of it.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Okay, so we've established the software, so to speak, the propaganda model, the intellectual filtering. But that software needs hardware to run on. What are the actual institutions, the machinery, that keep this whole thing locked in place? The source material gets very specific here, moving from the ideas to the money.
Right. This is where we need to explicitly map the system. And the first and most important node in that map is what the book calls the state-corporate nexus.
The source focuses heavily on the Pentagon system. And again, this is an idea that really surprised me. We're taught to think of the Pentagon as being about defense. It's there to protect the country from foreign enemies.
That's the public-facing narrative. But Chomsky argues that its primary function in the post-war American economy has been as a mechanism for industrial policy. It's a way for the state to funnel massive amounts of public money into high-tech industry.
So in public, we preach the gospel of the free market. We tell other countries, don't subsidize your industries, let the market decide.
But at home, we do the exact opposite. We just disguise it. At home, the Pentagon is the government picking winners and losers. Just think about the foundational technologies of the modern world. Computers, the internet, satellites and GPS, jet engines, pharmaceuticals, containerization. Where did the initial high-risk research for all of these things come from?
The story we're told is that it was some lone genius in a garage, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates.
That's the convenient myth. That's the second or third stage. The reality is that for decades, the incredibly expensive, high-risk, foundational R&D for almost the entire high-tech economy was funded by you, the taxpayer, through the military budget.
Walk us through the computer example because it's so stark.
Okay. In the 1940s and 50s, computers were these enormous room-sized machines that were fantastically expensive and constantly broke down. No private company in its right mind would want to buy one. There was no commercial market. IBM had a hard time finding any buyers, so who bought the early ones?
The government.
The military, the Air Force for its SAGE air defense system, the Atomic Energy Commission for calculating bomb yields. They bought virtually 100% of the early production runs. They poured money into the research to make them smaller, faster, and more reliable. The public took on all the initial risk.
So the taxpayer puts up all the money for the risky, unprofitable early stages.
And then once the technology is finally developed, once it's mature and reliable enough to be profitable, it's effectively handed over to private corporations like IBM, Intel, and later Apple and Microsoft to package and sell back to the public for a massive profit.
It's a system of socializing risk and privatizing profit.
That is the core dynamic. It's a giant hidden feedback loop. And the absolute genius of using the Pentagon system to do this is that it's politically unassailable. If a politician stood up and said, I propose we give a $200 billion grant to a few tech companies to help them develop the next generation of microchips, there would be public outrage. People would scream, corporate welfare.
But if that same politician says, we need a $200 billion weapons system to counter the threat from China.
Nobody bats an eye. It's about national security.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, to build that advanced weapons system, you need the next generation of microchips, which the tech companies get paid handsomely to develop, and then they get to keep the patents. The national interest becomes the ideological cloak for a massive public subsidy to private power.
And this connects directly back to our new mandarins. A huge part of their job is to keep the public scared, to keep selling the national security threat so that the money keeps flowing into that high-tech corporate sector.
Precisely. The system requires a plausible enemy. It doesn't even really matter who the enemy is. For 50 years, it was the Soviet Union and communism. Then it became international terrorism. Now it's shifting towards a new Cold War with a rival superpower. The specific enemy is interchangeable. The function of the enemy is to terrify the bewildered herd enough that they consent to having their tax dollars funneled into this system.
Which brings us to the next piece of the machinery, the media. Because if the Pentagon system is the engine of the economy, the media is the transmission system. It's what delivers the necessary narratives to the public.
Right, and here we can use the propaganda model that Chomsky developed with Edward Herman. It's a framework for understanding how the media works, not as a conspiracy, but as a system with predictable outputs. They identified 5 filters that any piece of information has to pass through before it can become mainstream news.
Okay, let's run through them, but let's try to connect them to what we see today.
The first filter is ownership. Who owns the major media outlets?
A handful of massive publicly traded corporations. Disney owns ABC, Comcast owns NBC, Warner Bros., Discovery owns CNN.
So right off the bat, you have a hard limit. These are major corporations. Do you think a news organization owned by one of these giants is going to produce a steady stream of content that seriously questions the legitimacy of corporate power itself?
Not likely. That would be like a car complaining about the existence of roads. It's a structural conflict of interest.
The second filter is advertising. Who pays the bills for the media?
Overwhelmingly, it's not the viewers or the readers. It's the advertisers. We, the audience, are not the customer. We are the product that is being sold to companies like Ford, Pfizer, and Amazon.
So the news itself just becomes the filler that attracts the right demographic eyeballs to see the ads. And that means the content of the filler has to be conducive to a buying mood. You can't run a hard-hitting documentary about the environmental devastation caused by car culture and then cut to a commercial for a brand new SUV. It creates what advertisers call audience-advertiser conflict.
So the news has to be safe. It has to be bland enough not to offend the people paying the bills.
The third filter is sourcing. This one is more subtle, but it's incredibly powerful.
Where do journalists get their stories?
Well, they're under constant pressure. They have to produce content every single day, every single hour. They don't have time to do a deep, independent investigation for every story. So they develop a routine. They congregate where the news is made.
The White House press briefing room, the Pentagon, police headquarters, corporate PR departments.
They rely on official sources. This gives institutions of power a massive built-in advantage in shaping the narrative. When the State Department issues a press release, that becomes the story. To challenge it requires a huge amount of work and resources. It's just cheaper, faster, and safer for the journalist to report what the powerful people said.
And the fourth filter is flack.
Flack is negative feedback, organized and weaponized. If a journalist or a news outlet steps too far out of line, if they publish a story that really threatens powerful interests, they get hit with a storm of flack.
Think tanks will publish studies attacking their credibility. Armies of online trolls will be mobilized. Advertisers will get calls from powerful people suggesting they pull their ads.
It's the system's immune response. It attacks and isolates the virus of genuine dissent to keep it from spreading. And the fifth filter, which they added later, is anti-communism, or today, the war on terror. It's the grand ideology that can be used to silence anyone.
If you question the military budget, you're soft on terror, or an apologist for our enemies.
Exactly. It's the ultimate conversation stopper. So these 5 filters, working together, create a media system that doesn't need overt censorship. It self-censors. It produces a view of the world that is, by and large, safe, corporate-friendly, and supportive of the status quo.
Okay, so we have the Pentagon funding the corporate economy. We have the media filtering our perception of reality. What does this mean for politics? I mean, we still get to vote. That has to count for something, right?
It does, but perhaps not in the way we think. This is where the source introduces what's called the investment theory of party competition, which was developed by a political scientist named Thomas Ferguson.
I found this part to be a complete paradigm shift, because the way we learn about democracy in school, the basic civics lesson, is that politicians are in the business of getting votes. Therefore, they have to listen to the voters to win.
That's the simple, elegant fairy tale. Ferguson's theory starts from a much more practical and I would say realistic premise. Running for major political office is unbelievably expensive. You need millions, now even billions of dollars. Where does that kind of money come from?
From large corporations, from industry groups, from the very wealthy. The donor class.
Ferguson calls them the investors. And his argument is that before parties can even think about competing for votes from the public, they first have to compete for funding from these major blocks of investors.
The analogy of a car dealership really works well here.
It's a perfect analogy. Imagine you, the voter, walk into a dealership. You want to buy a car. What you really want is a simple, affordable, reliable electric sedan. But the dealership, and in fact the entire auto industry, is owned by a small group of investors who have decided that the real profits are in selling massive, expensive, gas-guzzling SUVs.
So I walk onto the lot, and what are my choices? I can have the big red SUV or the big blue SUV.
Exactly. You are allowed to have a very vigorous debate about the relative merits of the red SUV versus the blue SUV. You can argue about the paint color, the leather seats, the sound system. You can get into fights with your neighbor over it.
But I cannot buy the electric sedan. It's not for sale. It's not even an option.
Because the investors who control the political market have decided that it's not on the agenda. And this explains so much about American politics. On issues where the major investor blocks, say Wall Street, the energy sector, the military-industrial complex, are in agreement, there is no meaningful difference between the two parties.
Like the size of the military budget or the basic framework of corporate-managed healthcare.
Those things are off the table. But on issues where the investors are divided, say the tech industry wants one kind of regulation and the old manufacturing industry wants another, that's when you get a real political fight. And that's when they come to you, the voter, to act as a tiebreaker between competing factions of the elite.
This explains that political science finding that the preferences of the average American have a statistically near zero impact on public policy. The source mentions studies showing that if 70 or 80% of the public wants something, but the economic elite doesn't, it doesn't happen.
And this is what keeps the public in a state that the source, using a quote from Marx, calls a sack of potatoes.
Yeah, let's unpack that image. It's a strange one, but it's powerful.
Marx was describing the French peasantry in the 19th century. He said they're a vast mass of people, but they're like potatoes in a sack. They're all in the same sack, but they don't have any real connection to each other. They're just a collection of isolated units.
They're atomized. They're not a coherent force.
Exactly. And the modern system of power needs us to be potatoes. It wants us to be isolated individuals, sitting alone in our living rooms, consuming media, consuming products, but not connecting with each other in any meaningful, organized way.
Because if the potatoes were to, say, get mashed together,
If they were to organize into powerful labor unions, into tenant unions, into genuine community-based political movements, they would stop being a sack of loose potatoes and start being a solid block, a cohesive force. And that force would have real power. That is why the system is, and has been for decades, so incredibly hostile to things like organized labor.
a union is the process of turning potatoes into a brick. A brick can challenge power. A potato just bounces off.
A very good way to put it. So the entire engineering of Consent Project at its core is about keeping us atomized, keeping us in the stands as spectators, making us feel that our only political act is to choose between the red SUV and the blue SUV, and most importantly, making us afraid of each other and afraid of the designated other.
Fear is the glue that holds it all together.
It is. We touched on the enemy earlier. The source material really emphasizes that manufacturing consent relies on manufacturing fear.
The communists are going to take over. The terrorists are under your bed. The immigrants are coming for your job.
It's a timeless technique. If you are afraid, you are not thinking clearly. You look for a strong leader to protect you. You defer to the authority of the experts, the mandarins. You don't ask difficult questions about the budget or civil liberties because your priority is safety. It keeps the population in a state of sort of infantile dependence.
This connects so deeply and directly to the whole theme of our project, to crisis in perception. We are trained to perceive all of these problems, war, inequality, political corruption, as the result of bad individuals. We think, oh, that's just a corrupt politician, or that's a greedy CEO.
If we could just elect a better person, more moral person, everything would be fixed.
That's the great man theory of history, and this entire analysis is a rejection of it. It's a systems analysis, it says. It's not about the moral character of the driver, it's about the design of the car. If you put the most peace-loving saint in the driver's seat of a tank, it's still a tank. It's still designed to crush things.
The role shapes the person, not the other way around. If you become the Secretary of Defense, you are immediately surrounded by the institutional pressures of the Pentagon, the lobbyists from the defense contractors, the generals with their own agendas. You can't just walk in and say, okay, everyone, we're going to turn the Pentagon into a global public health organization.
You would be removed or marginalized so fast your head would spin. The system selects for its own survival and perpetuation.
Right.
So this is a lot. It's a very bleak diagnosis. The patient, our democracy, is basically in a managed coma. It's being run by a priesthood of mandarins, it's fueled by a war-based economy, and the public is a bewildered herd of atomized potatoes. Pretty grim picture. Where's the way out? What does radical priorities offer, if anything, as a path forward?
Well, it's important to say that it doesn't offer a simple three-step plan to utopia. It's an analysis, not a prescription. But it does offer a fundamental reframing of what we should be prioritizing. And it starts with reframing our understanding of power.
Reframing power.
We're conditioned to think of power as domination. The ability to force other people to do what you want. The power of the state. The power of the boss. Chomsky argues that this is a perversion of a more fundamental human power. The power to create, the power to act freely in cooperation with others, and he points toward industrial democracy as the next great, unfinished project of human freedom.
We mentioned this at the start, taking democracy into the workplace.
Think about the profound contradiction. We live in a society that claims to cherish democracy above all else. We're told it's our most sacred value. And yet, most of us spend the majority of our waking lives, 8, 10 hours a day, inside institutions that are structurally totalitarian
The
dictatorship.
modern corporation.
Exactly. You don't elect your boss. You don't vote on what the company produces or how it produces it. You have no say in how the profits are distributed. It's a top-down command and control system. You are given orders, and if you disobey, you are exiled. You're fired. Chomsky's question is simple. Why do we accept that? Why does democracy stop at the factory gate or the office door?
If people are considered wise enough to vote for who should have their finger on the nuclear button, why aren't they considered wise enough to vote on how to organize the assembly line they work on every single day?
That is the radical priority. To extend the democratic principle out of the purely political sphere where it's already quite limited, and into the economic sphere where it is essentially non-existent. To give people a meaningful say in the decisions that affect them most directly.
And this all comes back to the final theme in the book, which is intellectual responsibility.
Yes. There's that famous, heroic-sounding cliche, one must speak truth to power.
We hear it constantly. It's what journalists are supposed to do.
But the analysis in this book argues that this is mostly a waste of time and a misunderstanding of how power works. Power already knows the truth. The executives at ExxonMobil have known the truth about climate change for 50 years. The planners at the Pentagon know the real casualty numbers. They're not misinformed. They're not confused.
They're just pursuing their own institutional interests.
Exactly. So telling them the truth is like reading the company's own annual report back to the CEO. It's pointless. So if you're not speaking truth to power, who should you be speaking to?
You speak truth to the powerless.
That's the argument. The responsibility of a truly ethical intellectual, or any decent human being really, is not to the powerful, but to the bewildered herd. The job is to help people see the invisible structures, the hidden mechanisms of control. It's to provide the context, the history, and the systems-level analysis that the mainstream media filters out by design.
So it's about giving the potatoes the information and the tools they need to start seeing themselves as a cohesive force.
Chuckles softly. That's one way to put it, yes. It's about treating the general public not as a herd to be managed, but as fellow citizens who, if given access to the truth and the freedom to organize, are perfectly capable of creating a more just and decent world.
It's a fundamental challenge to us, to everyone listening, to stop being passive spectators.
It is a profound one.
I want to leave our listeners with a final thought, a question that kept circling in my mind as I was reading this material. We are living in an age of technological miracles. We have artificial intelligence, automation, instant global communication. The new mandarins at MIT and their counterparts around the world have built tools that could, in theory, liberate humanity from most forms of toil and drudgery.
We have, for the first time in human history, the technical capacity to solve the economic problem. We could feed, clothe, and house everyone on the planet. We could all work far, far less.
So the question is, why aren't we? Why are people in wealthy countries working longer hours for less security than their parents did? Why is poverty and instability still rampant? If we have the tools for liberation, why do they seem to be creating new forms of control?
That is precisely the question that the entire engineering of consent system is designed to prevent you from asking, because the answer reveals the system's true priority. It's not designed to maximize human well-being or freedom. It's designed to maximize the power and profit of those at the top. It's designed for its own perpetuation.
And maybe it's time we started engineering our own consent for something fundamentally different.
That would be a radical priority indeed.
This deep dive was based on Radical Priorities by Noam Chomsky, edited by C.P. Otero, and The Responsibility of Intellectuals. Reflections by Noam Chomsky and others.
If you found this conversation challenging or even infuriating, that's a good thing. That's kind of the point. We would strongly encourage you to go to the source material yourself. Chomsky's prose can be, let's say, a bit dense and academic, but his technique of dissection, the way he takes an official document or a mainstream news article and just tears it apart line by line to expose the unspoken assumptions, it's really a masterclass in critical thinking.
It really is. It's a toolkit for mental self-defense. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini-explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.